G'day folks, and welcome back to the channel for a quick tutorial bite on early game components. Now these are the components that I'm going to suggest that pretty much every character should use at the end of Act 1. There is going to be a little bit of variance depending on the build you are using, however let's get on with the everyone should have these components and then we'll discuss that at the end. So starting out, you are going to want on your chest and potentially on your legs a scaled hide. Increasing your armor absorption by 20% and then another 20% will get your armor absorption up to 98%, which means you will be able to use your armor against almost all incoming physical damage. 2% of the incoming physical damage will go straight through your armor, but this is pretty close, and if you're playing a soldier, later on you'll be able to get that up to 100%, and there's various other options for other masteries as well. So we definitely want 2 scaled hides on our chest and legs. However, if you are going into Act 2 and your piercing resistance is not at least about 50%, you will want to have only one of these and instead have 2 silk swatches instead of one. So if you have high piercing resistance with only one silk swatch on your shoulders, then you want 2 scaled hides, and if you have your silk swatch on your shoulders already, and you still have low piercing resistance going into Act 2, then put 2 silk swatches on because piercing damage is more of a threat in Act 2 than physical damage. So that's chest, legs, and shoulders. Rings, you have 3 options depending on what has dropped for you. Now these are all drop-only options, and I'll go through them in order of least good to best. You are very likely to have polished emeralds, in fact pretty much guaranteed. This is kind of the minimum. 8 to all of your stats is pretty good. It's not great, but it's pretty good. So you can put these on rings, you can put them on your weapons, or at least your offhands, you can put them on your helmet, and you can put them on your chest. You pretty much should only put these on rings, and only really in Act 1, unless you happen to have some really, really nice piece of gear that you want to put on, but you're a handful of stat points short. If, however, you have some corpse dust, which can drop in Act 1, these are going to be better just for the health. The vitality resistance does help. There is a couple of fights in Act 2 that do a decent amount of vitality damage, but on the whole, you can usually get away with not really worrying about vitality resistance until Act 3, with the exception of Kilrian, and the other exception that some of the undead will be doing some vitality damage. So yes, you can get away with it. No, it's not good. Soul shards are drop only, and they're a decent bit rarer, so you're unlikely to have these at the end of Act 1. In fact, I can't remember ever having them. However, this is what you want to have later. So as soon as you start getting soul shards to drop, you want to be considering putting these on. They have 20% vitality resistance each, and in addition, you will absorb energy from enemy spells, which can help with any potential energy issues you may have. So that's for your rings. For your amulet and your medal, by default, you want ward stones. You will later replace these probably with either Aether Souls or Black Tallow, which are going to sort out your Aether or Chaos resistance issues. However, ward stones are good early because everybody can craft these. These are available by default. They require pretty much only Aether crystals, which you can farm before you get to the boss of Act 1, and they give good resistance and also movement speed. Helmet, boots, and gloves are a little bit weird in Act 1. So you'll see here that I have anti-venom salve on my boots and my helmet. That's not because there isn't anything better there, it's just because I need the poison resistance. So that's an option, anti-venom salve here for helmet, boots, gloves as needed. It's not ideal, but as needed. For boots, what you want is a Mark of the Traveler. However, these are drop only and you may not have one. When you do get one, if you don't have your boots being used for poison resistance, these are a good option, and I would say this is kind of the baseline default. It does require a drop though. For your gloves, the Unholy Inscription, again, is a drop only. It says it's rare. It's not. You will likely have one of these before you get too far into Act 2, and as long as you're not playing a full caster that doesn't do any weapon damage at all, the lifesteal on this component pretty much beats out everything else that could go in this slot. And then you also get 2 good resistances and some offensive ability on top. Unholy Inscription is pretty much the default option, I guess we'll say, for anyone that isn't playing a pure caster, and even then, if you have a spell that does weapon damage, you probably want this anyway. So this is a really good option. For your helmet early on, you don't have a huge amount of options. You could go with stats, and I would say this is a bare minimum. There's no reason to have an empty slot when you have polished emeralds just rotting in your bank. Chuck it on. It doesn't take much, and it's some free health, if nothing else. You also do have options like the anti-venom salve here. There are elemental resistance options for each one of them. However, the molten skin, for example, only gives fire resistance, so it's much better to get your elemental resistances from things that have elemental resistance rather than fire. So I don't consider them worth crafting pretty much ever. Maybe later in the game, if you happen to have 2 of your resistances capped, but one of them's a little bit under, maybe you could do that. But the best option early for your helmet is either going to be an anti-venom salve if you need the resistances, a polished emerald if you don't need anything at all, or an ectoplasm if you're having energy issues. So ectoplasm will give you 20% more energy, and then it'll also give you increased energy regen, which is really good. On your belt, you have exactly one option. No other option will be accepted. Anti-venom salve there for the plus 24 armor, which then gets applied to every single one of your armor slots. I'm not going to say you have to do this because it is a decent bonus, but you can absolutely go through Act 1 without any components. You can go through normal probably without any components, but you are kind of leaving character power on the table if you don't use any. So, anti-venom salve on the belt, wardstone on the medal and amulet, scaled hide on the chest, silk swatch on the shoulders. Depending on if you need to pierce resist, you want either a second scaled hide or a second silk swatch on your pants. Boots, gloves, and helmet. You can have stats on some of them. You can have anti-venom salves if you need that. However, Mark of the Traveler on boots, Unholy Inscription on gloves, and potentially Ectoplasm on helmet is the way to go. For weapons, it will depend on the type of damage you are going to do. This is a piercing build, so I have Vicious Spikes because that will give me piercing damage. Every other type, I'm not sure if that's true, most other types, potentially all other types, will have some other kind of damage buff component. If you're playing a cold build, especially if you're hitting things with your weapon, Cold Stone is the way to go. If you are doing poison, you want the Vitriolic Gallstones. If you're doing fire, you want Enchanted Flint, I think it is. But there is a component for each of your weapons for different damage types. Having said that, at the very least, you want resistances. You have Aether Resistance available here. Or you can, if I can spell correctly, you can do Chaos Resistance here. So these are the, I'm not going to say they're the worst options because they are really good, but these are kind of the ones you want to use if you don't have a damage component, or if you really need the resistance types. So that is your tutorial byte on early game components. So I'd like to thank you all very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and goodbye for now.